What a great honor it is to be here with two colleagues who are my media heroes, and to be here on this cold night that proves that those meetings in Copenhagen were about something very real. Yes, the whole issue of it's better to talk about, I think, climate disruption than global warming when we're having these kind of Arctic nights. But let me introduce our two guests tonight. Naomi Klein is a remarkable public intellectual, scholar, and activist. Her work is both groundbreaking and breathtaking. When Naomi was in Iraq, as the rest of the pundits were talking about President Bush not knowing what he was doing, she came out saying, no, he has a very clear plan. She wrote a piece in Harper's Magazine called Baghdad Year Zero, Pillaging Iraq in Pursuit of a Neocon Utopia. She broke through that small circle of pundits that we're used to seeing on all the channels, who know so little about so much, explaining the world to us and getting it so wrong. That's right, she broke through with what very few people have on television: facts. Facts that no one else seems to dig up. She so eloquently elucidates what the real plans are. But Naomi Klein is not just a critic. She's a chronicler and a leader of grassroots movements around the world. With her husband, Avi Lewis, they did the film The Take about Argentina and the retaking of the factories there. Before that, she wrote the book No Logo, and tonight here in New York, she's celebrating the 10th anniversary of that publication, which is as relevant or perhaps more relevant today than it was 10 years ago. As the rest of the media was saying, what is the Battle of Seattle? Naomi had already written a book about it. A character in John le Carré's novel Absolute Friends recommends Naomi Klein as the top of the reading that should be done if you want to understand post-Cold War corporate power. And I think her latest book certainly proves that. The Shock Doctrine, The Rise of Disaster Capitalism, remarkable shatterer of paradigms. I purposely am introducing Raj second because I didn't want to just come out here and say tonight we're talking about the value of nothing. Though that is the title of his new book, The Value of Nothing, How to Reshape Market Society and Redefine Democracy. And I was really excited to hear that he's just learned that it's hit the New York Times bestseller list, and it's just out. There is hope, and people do care. Raj Patel is the author of Stuffed and Starved. He's an activist and an academic, has been hailed as a visionary for his foresight when it came to the food crisis. And one of the things we're going to talk about, we'll begin with, is Haiti. And he talks eloquently about what happened in Haiti. Raj has worked for the World Bank and the World Trade Organization, and protested both on 4 continents. He is currently a visiting scholar at UC Berkeley Center for African Studies, and an honorary research fellow at the School of Development Studies at the University of KwaZulu-Natal. He's also a fellow at the Institute for Food and Development Policy, also known as Food First. And most importantly, his wife is about to have a baby. His partner is about to have a baby any day now. And it's nice to be able to smile and celebrate life on a very difficult night like tonight, where who knows exactly what is the death toll in Haiti. The horror that started unfolding last night about 5 o'clock when we learned that there had been an earthquake. I think Carrefour is the epicenter. And now the numbers, we don't even know. It could be 100,000, one Haitian official was saying, of people who have died. The Archbishop of Haiti was killed, the head of the UN mission was killed. And we don't know, certainly, anywhere near the number of people as people are being dug out, as the wails are still being heard. And that's where I think we should begin tonight, because both of you have so eloquently talked about the issue. I think it's interesting, Naomi, in your book, The Shock Doctrine, though you didn't address it, I was asking you about Haiti, and you said actually it was a chapter that she had written and ended up writing for The Nation magazine on Haiti. But I think we're really talking about twin earthquakes here, twin crises that have rocked Haiti. One is the natural catastrophe that they are dealing with today, the worst earthquake in, 2 centuries. But then there is what is human-made, and that is the earthquake, the hurricane, the crisis of poverty, and how that exacerbates the effect of this earthquake. And that's where I wanted to start with Raj Patel. In Stuffed and Starved, you write about Haiti. Talk about what we should understand. The corporate media does a good job of getting there and showing us the horror of what's happening, and you should demand of all the networks that they stick with it so that we know people do care, people are hungry for information about what is happening to our fellow and sister human beings in Haiti. I think that's proven over and over again. So we're seeing this natural catastrophe unfold, but put it in the context of the politics of this poorest country in the Western Hemisphere.
Well, Haiti was an inspiration. I mean, it's important to remember that Haiti was the site of the first slave rebellion. And the rebellion in 1794 is something that we need to absolutely continue to be inspired by. But for that, it has been relentlessly punished by by Europe and then by the United States. And it's a country that's been through prolonged occupation by the United States, and the weapons that the United States has most recently leveled against Haiti have been predominantly economic. I mean, Haiti, at the beginning of the 1980s, grew the majority of its own rice. It was a country that was able to grow and able to sustain the majority of its population domestically. But because the people of Haiti had made choices about a government that was left-wing and wanted to have a left-wing government, it was punished by two U.S. presidents, Presidents Reagan and Clinton. And both those presidents imposed economic structural adjustment policies that meant that Haiti was forced to open up its certainly its food markets to the so-called free market. Of course, there is no free market in food, and the U.S. rice industry, according to the Cato Institute, in some years gets almost $1 billion a year in subsidy. And so, on the one hand, you had Haitian rice farmers, some of the poorest people certainly in the Western Hemisphere, who were forced to compete against U.S. rice farmers getting $1 billion a year in subsidy. And so, it's not surprising that the Haitian rice farmers read the economic signals clearly, and first started by exploiting themselves, and then responded by going to the cities and abandoning farming. The only rice farming that exists now in Haiti is subsistence. It's not for the market. And so Haiti was intentionally made dependent on U.S. rice imports. And then, of course, when the price of rice went up in 2008 by 30% in a single day on the international market, there were what were called food riots, or what I've termed with some colleagues at Food First, food rebellions. And those rebellions were obviously demands for rice, but they were also expressions of political change, demands for political change. And in fact, I mean, every so-called food riot always has a political component to it. I mean, the news media will make it to a food riot, so-called, after it's happened, and what they will see is pictures of tires burning in the road, and then there'll be some breathless, urgent commentary on, the people were just here, and you won't believe what they were doing, and they were trying to smash their way into getting food. And of course, access to food is always a part of a food riot. But the food protests in Haiti were also politically articulate demands for the return of Jean-Bertrand Aristide, who was displaced in a series, in fact, not just once, displaced in a series of coups. And these politically articulate protests have been systematically stamped out. And so what we have in Haiti is a long history of US intervention, of using markets as a means to subjugate the population and to punish the population for their own desire for autonomy. And yet, of course, in the reconstructed media picture, Haitians are portrayed not as politically articulate and organized and thoughtful, but merely as people running from one chaotic scene to another in search of food. And that's something that we need absolutely to redress. And so when we see these images on TV, we need to insist not only that the media portray what's actually happening, but give the context.
Before we talk about how Haiti fits into your idea of the shock doctrine, Naomi, just a little back history. You talked about Haiti being born out of a slave uprising in 1804. The U.S. Congress for decades would not recognize the Republic of Haiti because it was born of a slave uprising, and the Congress members in the U.S. Congress were afraid it would inspire U.S. slaves to rise up. 1915 to 34, the first U.S. occupation by the U.S. Marines of Haiti. And then when President Aristide was elected in 1990, the almost immediate, within a year, coup that has been proven was also backed by the Central Intelligence Agency. Aristide was forced out for 3 years. 91 to 94 came back to serve out his term, about a year. I directly had the experience of the second time President Aristide was forced out in 2004 because I followed a small delegation when he was whisked onto a plane by U.S. military and security with the First Lady, Mildred Aristide, and they were flown off to, they didn't know where. Turned out to be the Central African Republic, Bangui, the capital, where they were held, basically, in captivity. This small delegation led by Congressmember Maxine Waters, will have her on Democracy Now! Tomorrow to talk about what her thinking on Haiti is right now. Congressmember Maxine Waters and Randall Robinson, the founder of Trans-Africa, along with a Jamaican parliamentarian who is coming with an invitation for the Aristides to return to this hemisphere, to come to Jamaica. I followed them in a plane, an all too small plane. We flew from Miami, across the ocean to Senegal, Dakar, Senegal, and Cape Verde, and we ended up in Bangui, the Central African Republic, where they went to retrieve the Aristides and actually succeeded. And as we flew back through Africa and across the Atlantic and ultimately landed in Jamaica, the threats were coming in fast and furious from the Bush administration, from Secretary of State Colin Powell and others in Rumsfeld, who were saying if the Aristides were not to enter this hemisphere, to which Randall Robinson said on the plane, whose hemisphere? And we're certainly not to come near Haiti. Whose country? The Aristides returned to Jamaica, but were ultimately not able to go back to Haiti, and they now live in South Africa in exile. So that is the story of the attempts at democracy in Haiti. How would you put that, Naomi Klein, into the context of the shock doctrine, the rise of disaster capitalism, and take it right through now from the hurricanes to this earthquake?
Well, thank you, Amy. And, that history is so important that you both provided in terms of understanding this particular political moment and some of the things we really need to watch for as the world rightly rushes to Haiti's aid. Because we are in this context of really centuries of trying to bend Haiti to our will, to Western will, to discipline this fiercely independent country using all means available. And debt has always been the primary tool of disciplining Haiti from its period of independence, to the extent that, we have these debates in this country about reparations for slavery and the right of African Americans to be paid in some form for the theft of their ancestors and the broken promise of 40 acres and a mule. What we often don't hear is that liberated slaves, in many cases, had to pay reparations to their former owners for their freedom. And the greatest example of that is Haiti, when Haiti was forced to pay reparations to France. So it began in this debt. It was never actually free. And this has been an ongoing battle. And in fact, Aristide, this was one of the theories about why France was so determined to get rid of him, and the U.S. was the precedent. There was a lawsuit that he was in the process of suing the French government for the original sort of odious debt that was imposed on Haiti. It became more sophisticated over the years, and as Raj spoke about, that structural adjustment policies became the tool for disciplining Haiti. But as I write about in the shock doctrine, crises are often used now as the pretext for pushing through policies that you cannot push through under times of stability. Countries in periods of extreme crisis are desperate for any kind of aid, any kind of money, and are not in a position to negotiate fairly the terms of that exchange. And I just want to pause for a second and read you something, which is pretty extraordinary. I just put this up on my website. The headline is, "Haiti, Stop Them Before They Shock Again." This went up a few hours ago, 3 hours ago, I believe, on the Heritage Foundation website. Amidst the suffering, crisis in Haiti offers opportunities to the U.S. In addition to providing immediate humanitarian assistance, the U.S. response to the tragic earthquake in Haiti offers opportunities to reshape Haiti's long dysfunctional government and economy, as well as to improve the image of the United States in the region. And then goes on. Now, I don't know whether things are improving or not, because it took the Heritage Foundation 13 days before they issued 32 free market solutions for Hurricane Katrina. We put that document up on our website as well. It was close down the housing projects, turn the Gulf Coast into a tax-free free enterprise zone, get rid of the labor laws that forces contractors to pay a living wage. So it took them 13 days before they did that in the case of Katrina. In the case of Haiti, they didn't even wait 24 hours. Now, why I say I don't know whether it's improving or not is that 2 hours ago, they took this down. So somebody told them that it wasn't couth, and then they put up something that was much more delicate. Fortunately, the investigative reporters at Democracy Now! Managed to find that earlier document in a Google cache, but what you'll find now is a much gentler things to remember while helping Haiti. And buried down there it says, long-term reforms for Haitian democracy and its economy are also badly overdue. But the point is, we need to make sure that the aid that goes to Haiti is, one, grants, not loans. This is absolutely crucial. This is an already heavily indebted country. This is a disaster that, as Amy said, on the one hand, is nature, is an earthquake. On the other hand, is the creation, is worsened by the poverty that our governments have been so complicit in deepening. Crises, natural disasters are so much worse in countries like Haiti because you have soil erosion, because the poverty means people are building in very, very precarious ways. So houses just slide down because they're built in places where they shouldn't be built. All of this is interconnected. But we have to be absolutely clear that this tragedy, which is part natural, part unnatural, must under no circumstances be used to, one, further indebt Haiti, and two, to push through unpopular corporatist policies in the interests of our corporations. And this is not a conspiracy theory. They have done it again and again. So, this is when you need to be vigilant. And frankly, this is why I wrote the book, because the whole point is that in these moments of crisis, we are, everybody just wants to help. And we want to say, send money, and of course send money. But we also need to send these political messages at the same time. Do not use aid as a tool to control.
Go further, and especially because we also have a C-SPAN audience here, and we thank C-SPAN for covering this. In talking about the thesis of the shock doctrine, especially disaster capitalism, it's not something that most people frame the world by, and you truly shattered a paradigm when you came out with this book.
Well, the thesis of the book is that these policies of deregulating the labor market, privatizing basic services like health and education, these are unpopular policies. And during times of non-crisis, it is very hard for politicians to get these policies through, certainly not all at once. And so there is a body of literature particularly among Chicago School economists, about the interrelationship between what they call crisis and reform, and about how economists need to be aware that in moments of crisis, one is able to use the emergency atmosphere to push through unpopular reforms all at once. And this has been, this is what the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund have been doing for 30 years, very clearly. I mean, why does a country come to the IMF in the first place? Because they're having an economic crisis, right? And the whole idea of structural adjustment is based on the premise. A country comes to the IMF on its knees, says, we need help, and the IMF has all the power. And they say, fine, we'll give you a loan, but in exchange for that loan, you need to privatize your electricity company and your telephone company and open it up to competition, which means foreign multinationals, and you need to liberalize your labor market, and you need to liberalize your banking sector, and all these things. What I write about in the shock doctrine is that the crises that are being exploited to push through these policies are getting bigger. It isn't only an economic crisis now, it is also natural disasters. And I write about how I think a really important precedent for this was also in our hemisphere, which was Hurricane Mitch, which was 1998, which devastated Central America, and the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund directly tied the aid to the countries hit by Hurricane Mitch to demands that they this is Honduras, Guatemala, privatize electricity, privatize water, phones, and also introduce very controversial land reform policies. This has nothing to do with responding to the crisis. It's just that when you have money that people need, you have power. This is something that the U.S. Treasury doesn't seem to understand. Because when they were handing out trillions of dollars to the banks, they didn't think it was a good idea to put any conditions on it. But they actually could have.
As we talk about the banks, Raj, lay out your thesis and the value of nothing.
Well, it's becoming abundantly clear that free markets or free market capitalism has let us down. It was shocking to me to see Alan Greenspan in October 2008 admit that there was a flaw in the ideology that he thought had been working quite well for 40 years.
By the
Thanks,
way,
Alan.
you can go to democracynow.org. When we had Raj on the other day, just put Raj's name in, or put Raj and Alan Greenspan together, and
please don't.
And we play an excerpt of Henry Waxman questioning Alan Greenspan as Alan Greenspan talks about the flaw in his thinking.
And of course, we're confronted with this flaw, and the way the mainstream media dealt with it was, Alan Greenspan got it wrong. Movie at 11. And there wasn't really a sort of deep engagement with, actually, this is one of the scions of free market policy, having to take it back. And now, of course, the way the Chicago School, after a period of reflection and panic, has responded is to say, well, of course we got it wrong because markets weren't free enough. And that's, that's their official response. But just for a moment, Alan Greenspan kind of offered a break. And I don't think we're equipped to know how to deal with that. I mean, as I say in the book, I mean, we wake up being told that actually this philosophy of free market ideology has a flaw. And it's like in Kafka, in Metamorphosis, where after a night of bad dreams, Gregor Samsa wakes up to find himself in the body of a cockroach. And in that story, what does Gregor Samsa do? He doesn't wonder, well, how the hell did I end up in the body of a cockroach? He doesn't wonder, well, what am I going to wake up as tomorrow? What he worries about is his job. And in a sense, that's entirely reasonable, right? We wake up, the economy's falling around, falling apart around us. We're told that actually the system doesn't work. And of course we worry about our jobs. But it's also a chance to think about how the markets went wrong and what we might replace them with. And so in the book, I sort of spent some time talking about where the flaws in the free market, in free market fundamentalism come from, how the ideology became triumphant. But then in the second half of the book, look at different ways in which we can value things without sticking price labels on them. I mean, the impulse is just we can only value things if the market has passed judgment on how much it is worth and ascribes a dollar value. But there are other forms of valuing that don't involve prices. The latest Nobel Prize in Economics, in part, was won by Elinor Ostrom for her work on the commons. Now, I talk in the book about how commons becomes a way in which we can value things together, where we have resources and rules for governing those resources. But I also talk about how actually commons were forged in struggles around capitalism, and they continue to be forged in struggles around capitalism. Elinor Ostrom didn't win a prize for fighting capitalism. She won a prize merely for describing the process of the commons. But in the book, I actually talk a lot about some of the other movements that around the world offer a great deal of inspiration in terms of figuring out other ways that we might value things, and thereby actually offer a way of getting to the heart of the quote that defines the book, that people today know the price of everything and the value of nothing. And that, of course, is an Oscar Wilde quote. And Oscar Wilde, people should know, was a socialist. It's just important to say the word, without the vegetables being thrown. Socialism, ladies and gentlemen. And again, the purpose of the book is just being that it's okay to say it. And in many ways, the alternatives have been suppressed. Did you know, for example, that the Dalai Lama has said, "I am a Marxist monk"? It doesn't get reported, when he's sort of arms around Richard Gere, or usually Richard Gere's arms around him. This is not something that features. And of course, it's important that the Dalai Lama say, "I am a Marxist monk," because here's someone who's been confronted with the full power of a so-called communist state against the Chinese government. And you would fully expect someone who'd been up against the Chinese state in the way that he has to be hateful of Marxism. But actually, there's more about social justice and about fairness and equality in Marx than there is in the writings of Milton Friedman. And you would expect, therefore, a little bit more interest. But so some of those ideas are in the book, and I try to pull them together.
Talk more about these different movements, but start by talking about the value of a hamburger.
So one of the ways to start thinking about how markets misprice the way that we live is to look at food. I spend a lot of time thinking about food, and a hamburger, when we confront it in the stores, is what, $4 if you buy it at your local burger joint. But researchers in India a little while ago did some work on how much it would cost if you fully incorporated the environmental cost. And they looked at if this burger was once grown on pasture, and that pasture once upon a time used to be rainforest. Then it's possible to impute a dollar value to the stuff you lose by deforesting. And you lose biodiversity, you lose the carbon that's sequestered in the forest, you lose the oxygen that's being produced, you lose a range of ecosystemic services. And if you were to impute a dollar value to that value would be $200. And that's just for $200 per hamburger, just for the environmental costs. But there are other things that are not included in prices. For example, if that hamburger is consumed in the United States, then the chances are that tomatoes in that hamburger are grown in southern Florida. And many of you may know about the coalition of immokalee workers, of workers in southern Florida who pick tomatoes, who are in conditions of modern-day slavery. Now, I don't use that term lightly. I mean, it is, over 1,000 people have been freed under the statutes that constitute an abolition in the United States. I mean, 1,000 people freed from conditions where they are chained in the back of trailers, where they are forced to pay for showers, $5 to have a shower. And they're picking pesticide-soaked tomatoes all day. And some people find it cheaper to wash their hands in bleach. Healthcare dollars in the United States is spent treating someone with diabetes, $187 billion a year. That's due in no small part to the costs associated with the way we eat. And again, we don't pay that when we pay our $4 hamburger. So markets systematically hide the real costs of things. And there are movements that are fighting to get those costs back in. Everything from, as I say, the coalition of immokalee workers to, capitalism, for example, systematically excludes the costs of women's labor. Capitalism takes an ongoing subsidy from the reproductive labor that usually women perform in terms of raising children, of maintaining community. And if you added all that up, as UN researchers did in '95, you get a very big bill indeed, $17 trillion. Half the total world's output is premised on unpaid women's labor. And one of the most inspiring movements for me is the La Via Campesina, the peasant way. Is this coalition of 150 million farmers, farm workers, and peasants around the world. And they have a vision of economic justice, of leveling the inequalities in power, called food sovereignty. And if you want to know more about it, Wikipedia has a very good definition of food sovereignty. But I think the power of this kind of counter-movement can be found in the slogan. Food sovereignty is about an end to all forms of violence against women. So there you go. Food sovereignty is about an end to all forms of violence against women. Now that's a radical vision. It starts with the idea of sort of food production, about people being able to control the food system. But it takes the idea that there's inequalities in power from the household to the IMF and the World Trade Organization, and talks about the structural violence against women, as well as domestic violence, but the structural violence that prevents women from selling their product in the market, for being able to send their girls to school, being able to actually have a so-called level playing field. And for me, this idea of food sovereignty is where there's a great deal of hope and a great deal of promise in terms of reigning in the market.
And what is Anton's blindness?
Anton's blindness. There's a neurological disease that you get when you have a stroke or when you have a traumatic brain injury. If you have Anton's blindness, you are cortically blind. The signals from your eye don't go to the back of your head. But what people with Anton's blindness, you can tell that people have Anton's blindness because although they are cortically blind, they insist that they can see. So if you have Anton's blindness, you are cortically blind, but you insist that you have vision. And again, I use this as a metaphor for talking about how we move in our economy. Because, again, we've been told that markets aren't working for us. But we make excuses for markets. We confabulate. And in fact, you can diagnose Anton's blindness because when neurologists suspect someone has Anton's blindness, you can imagine people with Anton's blindness tend to bump into things, right? They are blind, but they'll stumble along into something, and then they will make up a story about why this thing. I was just being careless. Who moved that there? And these confabulations become a way of diagnosing the disease. Now, actually, that's a metaphor for the way that we've moved in our economy. We're making excuses for the failure of market capitalism. We say, well, we should have had more regulation. Who allowed Bernie Madoff to run off with our money? We make these sort of little stories around the edge, but we miss the fundamental problem that actually we believe that we can see through markets, but actually we see very little. And we need to develop other ways of sensing and valuing that aren't about this faulty faculty of market fundamentalism.
Just a few of the reasons after we have our discussion you should get a copy of The Value of Nothing. And by the way, everyone will be signing books afterwards, and we encourage you to ask questions on those index cards. I think they were passed out, or they will be, if you'd like to ask a question. Very good. And we'll come to them soon. But Naomi, we were just together at the end of December at this remarkable world gathering in Copenhagen for 2 weeks, what some call the most important diplomatic summit in history, over an issue that in this country does not get very much attention, but in the rest of the world is of grave concern and a central point for organizing. It was hard to go to any event at this global climate change summit without seeing Naomi Klein on the stage. Everywhere, from the Bella Center to the People's Summits outside, whether she was moderating an event or giving a speech, you were really central to this whole event, Naomi. Talk about the significance of it.
Well, Copenhagen. I'm really glad I went. I spoke at the opening of Klima Forum about my climate guilt, having flown there, and the argument that I made was that the fact that many of us had, a lot of people came there on solar-powered buses and things like that, but certainly those of us from North America didn't swim, and that really the onus was on us because of that to just work like crazy to make this summit meaningful, to challenge the corporate takeover of the environmental movement, which was really just so stark inside the official forum, to challenge all the false solutions to climate change that are upstaging the real solutions, the only solutions to climate change, which really do involve changing some of the things we do. We can't, we can't just trade our way out of this, as so many politicians would have us believe. And so the argument that I made at Klima Forum that first night was that if we really did our work, if we really made our voices heard, this would be the mother of all carbon offsets. And it was an extraordinary 2 weeks. I have to say, I think Democracy Now! Did absolutely unbelievable work. And really, to me, it's never been clearer how crucial Democracy Now! Is than during those 2 weeks. Nobody else in the U.S. media was, certainly not in the broadcast media, was making the commitment to this issue. And it's funny when you're in one of these gatherings, to you, this is the only story in the world, right? Because it feels like everybody must be talking about it. But then you hear from your friends back home, actually, it's kind of barely making the front page, and, it's barely making the news. And that was what was so wonderful about what Democracy Now! Did, which is just decide, this is the most important story, and we are going to go to Copenhagen, bring the whole staff, bring the whole broadcast, and broadcast live from the summit. It would have been nice if some of the major networks did that. They didn't. And so, all this talk of, it's the most important diplomatic event of the year, in the world, in history, a lot of that was coming from the UN and coming from the politicians, I guess 6 months ahead, when they thought that they were going to get a decent deal. By the time the summit itself rolled around, everyone was lowering expectations. Certainly U.S. politicians, there'll be more summits, don't worry, it's no big deal. After they had been saying it's one last chance to save the world, and Todd Stern, I quoted him in Rolling Stone, said that he compared the U.S. to, he said we need to summon the superhero spirit, and it's like meteors hurtling towards Earth. And, but by the time Copenhagen rolled around, he was also lowering expectations. Chief U.S. negotiator for the Obama administration. But what was exciting about Copenhagen was just the force of civil society, but also, to me, that climate change really changed decisively in the discourse, certainly the official discourse around climate change, from being, I don't know, I think people tend to think of environmental issues as sort of a luxury issue and something that people who have time on their hands can worry about. What happened in Copenhagen is that the Global South roared and said, this is about poverty, this is about justice, this is about debt, and put this issue of climate debt decisively on the global agenda. And climate debt, for those of you who don't know, is the argument, the basic argument, that is really, the facts are not controversial. The facts are these. 20% or between 17 and 20% of the world's population living in developed countries, living in countries like the US and Canada and Australia, are responsible for between 75 and 80% of the emissions that created the climate crisis. Because they weren't just created this year, they were created over a period of 200 years. So 20% creates 80% of the emissions. According to the leading World Bank economist on this issue, the effects of climate change are being felt overwhelmingly in the developing world. So what he says is that 75% of the effects of climate change are being felt in the poorest parts of the world. So you have a direct inverse relationship between cause and effect, between who is creating this crisis and who is living the effects. So here, in this country, we are feeling pretty relaxed about climate change, having lots of debate about whether it's real or not. Meanwhile, temperatures are rising dramatically in Africa. The droughts are already here. We're not talking about grandchildren. We're talking about now. I think Bill McKibben said, one thing I want, if there's one message to take home from Copenhagen, it's that it's not about your grandkids. It's about now. It's about islands facing extinction within 50 years. It is about the fact that Manila was underwater just a couple of months ago in an extraordinary flood that is directly connected to climate change. That India was battered this year by these bizarre cyclones going in between drought and flooding. This is happening all around the world. So when I say the South roared in Copenhagen, what happened in Copenhagen, and we heard this from the chief negotiator of the G77, the developing country bloc, was the people who created this crisis have to bear the burden of solving the crisis and also pay for what it's going to take to solve this crisis, which both means adapting to climate change, making countries more resilient to extreme weather. And here, if we look at Haiti and what's happening there, even though that's not linked to climate change, you can see what that would mean. Why is Haiti in so much trouble right now? A big part of it is because they don't have first responders. They don't have the infrastructure to respond to the crisis. So we need to be helping to pay for that, because that is part of responding to climate change. And of course, we also need to be helping countries leapfrog over fossil fuels to greener technologies, greener sources of energy, which have heavy upfront costs, and a lot of that has to do with technology, so you can't talk about responding to climate change without talking about loosening intellectual property laws entrenched by organizations like the World Trade Organization.
Can you just explain, when you say these countries like islands face extinction with the rise of temperatures, explain why?
Because we're talking about low-lying islands like the Maldives, Tuvalu, because as glaciers melt, the waters rise, and if they're low-lying islands, it's already happening. It's already happening to Tuvalu, where they're losing land mass very, very quickly. Bangladesh, this is also similar to what's going on in Haiti in terms of seeing the connection between bad agricultural policies, bad export-driven agricultural policies, and vulnerability to climate change. in the context of Haiti, you see it with soil erosion and what that means when a hurricane hits or when an earthquake hits, and how people's homes are destroyed so much more quickly than they would otherwise be. In Bangladesh, the World Bank has been pushing shrimp farming very, very hard, export-driven shrimp farming. So mangroves, which form a natural barrier when storms come, have been wiped out in huge parts of the country in order for Bangladesh to pay their World Bank debts. Raj knows much more about this than me, and he can correct me if I'm getting this wrong. But so you have these layers of debts building up in these countries, where you have a kind of an ecological debt from these World Bank policies, these bad environmental policies, destroyed the natural barriers, the mangroves, and then when climate change hits, when the storms start coming fast and furious, the natural barrier isn't there, so Bangladesh starts losing landmass, and that's what's happening there. So what was extraordinary about Copenhagen was that the developing country bloc, the G77, made this demand of repayment of climate debt a key demand. And there are some people here tonight from the Bolivian delegation. Bolivia was extraordinary in Copenhagen, a small country that doesn't usually sort of make news in these international summits, came to Copenhagen with a really radical, really transformative set of demands, and Bolivia has really been leading the charge on this idea that climate debt can be an alternative to the way we deal with the climate crisis, because it isn't just about saying, you're bad, you did bad things, you owe us money. This is the way the Western press has been reporting on it. One of the things that was really clear coming from the climate justice movement in Copenhagen was the message that actually you can't put a dollar amount on the loss of land mass in Bangladesh, on the loss of glaciers in Bolivia, on the fact that the capital city of Bolivia, La Paz, is quite possibly going to be facing a very severe water crisis, a shortage of drinking water within, Ellie, like the next 30 years or less. And this is because of climate change. It's a landlocked country. Its water comes from the glaciers. If the glaciers melt, the country loses its drinking water. How do you put a price on that? How do you put a price on that? You can't and you shouldn't. But we can talk about justice. And what Angelica Navarro, who was the climate negotiator for Bolivia in the lead up to these negotiations, was talking about was a Marshall Plan for planet Earth. And this is a really exciting idea because it isn't just the punitive idea. It is that by acknowledging that we owe these debts, and by the way, this is not a bizarre, far-out idea. This is nothing more than the polluter pays principle that is enshrined in U.S. law and that has been used under mechanisms like the Superfund, that polluters should pay for the effects of their practices. In this case, we are the polluters. And this doesn't necessarily mean that taxpayers have to pay the burden. It can be levied from corporations, which it should be levied from corporations. It shouldn't be regular people who are paying this climate debt, but the debt is real. And with those resources, we could be solving our two most pressing crises at once, which is massive inequalities between North and South, and also the climate crisis, by putting real resources behind this transformation from fossil fuels to cleaner energies. And I think it's a really inspiring idea. I don't think it's a punitive idea. And that, to me, it was worth the trip to witness that and to be part of that spectacular moment. That was completely ignored in the U.S. press.
The solution in the United States that people talk about is carbon trading, although that is being debated now. You have this big carbon trading summit that's been taking place these last few days, actually, here in New York. And interestingly, James Hansen, the NASA climatologist, one of the leading climatologists in the world, held a news conference. He's very much against climate trading, doesn't see that as an answer. He wrote an op-ed piece in the New York Times, and then Paul Krugman wrote an op-ed piece basically saying, Jim, go back to your science, you're a great climatologist, but you don't know what you're talking about when it comes to carbon trading. That is the answer. Raj Patel, I wanted to ask you about the value of carbon.
Well, yeah, I mean,
and explain what carbon trading is.
Oh, well, I mean, essentially, what I mean, the idea behind carbon trading is that when you, I mean, it's sort of premised on this idea that we're living in a tragedy of the commons. Now, a tragedy of the commons, if people don't know, was an article written in 1968 by a soil scientist called Garrett Hardin, which he published as a thought experiment. And the thought experiment is that if, imagine that we're all, we all live around a forest, and we all, we enjoy trees, and we enjoy using trees. And so, because we're all selfish individuals, and no one owns the forest, we're going to go in and chop those trees down, and then we will take them back, and we will carve them and burn them and do whatever it is we want to do with those trees. And we'll keep going back into the forest. But the tragedy is that our selfish desires overrun any possibility of us managing that forest. And because no one owns the forest and can tell us to bugger off, we will continue to use that forest and destroy it. And the tragedy is that with eyes wide open, we will destroy the resource on which we depend. We will, saw the branch off that we're sitting on. Now, that's the tragedy of the commons. And I mean, as I talk about in the book, actually that's nothing like the way commons used to be. In fact, we're not just selfish, greedy individuals. We are adapted to be much more than that. We are sociable, we are generous, we are cooperative, we can be altruistic. But I mean, the idea that if you own something, you will take care of it, and if it is unowned, then it is unmanageable, is kind of the driving idea behind this idea of carbon trading. That when you privatize the right to pollute, when you give industry the right to pollute the atmosphere, and then you gently ratchet that right down, the market will allocate resources so that the capacity to pollute the atmosphere is priced correctly. It's like the Woody Allen line, "I am at two with nature." I mean, he has this idea that he can't be at one with nature. He's when he says, "I am at two with nature," I mean, essentially, the idea behind carbon trading is that you respect the environment, but then, of course, you go and trade away the right to despoil it and to destroy it. There are sites that parody this, like Cheat Neutral, the website where people having difficulty maintaining fidelity in their relationships can buy offsets for the way that they, for cheating from people who are very good at being monogamous. But I mean, the trouble is that, I mean, in theory, it could work. In theory, if there were markets, if there were ways of transferring things, if the infrastructure were in place, if we lived in some sort of perfect textbook world, perhaps carbon trading could work. In the real world, it never can. And in fact, if you look at the examples of carbon trading that have already been established in Europe, they've been pretty bad. In the book, I quote, I draw on the work of Larry Lohman, who is a tremendous climate change activist, and managed to quote someone from Citigroup, one of the analysts at Citigroup, who'd been analyzing the European emissions trading scheme, and his summary was, looking at the winners and losers from carbon trading. The winners were, polluting industries, particularly coal and nuclear won big out of carbon trading from the free emissions permits that they got. The biggest winners, of course, were banks. The banks that have been making, that have been making a great deal of money shifting these things around. That's why Goldman Sachs is very, very excited about what could be a multi-trillion-dollar market in carbon emissions. And of course, this cap and trade, the emissions trading shares the same DNA with the derivatives trading that got us into such trouble earlier on, a couple of years ago. We should be suspicious of it for that reason. But empirically, again, what we've seen is banks making a lot of money, polluters making a lot of money, emissions are up, and consumers are worse off in Europe.
Explain just how exactly it works for people who just really don't get carbon trading in a nutshell. So there are permits to pollute, and the government will
ascribe the permits to emit a certain amount of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. And if you are a polluting industry, you will do your best to try and get as many of those permits you can for free. But there is a finite number of those permits. And so if you're not reducing your carbon emissions below the permitted level, you can buy permits from someone who's actually doing a good job of reducing the amount of carbon that they produce. So those permits then float around in a market so that if you're doing really badly, you will buy a permit to pollute from someone who's doing a good job of not using their allocation. And again, I mean, in theory it sounds terrific, except of course it has a net result of encouraging pollution. This isn't a polluter pays principle. It's a polluter earns principle. And that's one of the reasons why it's been so deeply flawed in Europe.
And it's very easy to cheat. I mean, it's ridiculously easy to cheat because how do you establish that you are doing a good job? Well, you can you prove that you are emitting less than you were before, or you were planning to emit. So there might be, you might close a factory and move that factory might become a contract factory in China, for instance. And this is a big part of the reason why Europe's emissions have gone down. Directly linked to the decimation of their manufacturing sector. Is it that those goods aren't being produced anywhere? No, they just moved the site of production, right? So companies can claim, well, we've really cleaned up our act, when all that means is that they've offshored their manufacturing. Or they can say, we were planning to expand, but we cut back. And it's kind of an honor system. Well, how do we know that they actually were planning that? It's something that's pretty easy to doctor. So I think it is a moment it's fair to be pretty suspicious when we look at who the people would be who would be regulating this thing and who the people who would be benefiting. Okay, so do we want to leave it, to Tim Geithner and Goldman Sachs? And I'm sorry if that sounds like guilt by association, but if they cannot regulate the financial sector, why do we think that they can regulate something as ephemeral as a carbon sector? But I think that the bigger issue is Raj's other point, which is just that we're wasting time. There is no urgency to this solution, and that is the biggest problem with it. It does not reflect the urgency that the science tells us we should be feeling, that we need to be on a different course by 2012. That's why this meeting should have been so much more important than it actually was. Any measure that allows us to continue as if nothing has changed, to continue our practices because we were able to buy a few pollution credits from somebody else, that is wasting valuable time. And I think that that's the most important issue that we need to focus on. And I think that certainly the young people in the environmental movement really know that. And one of the things that was really striking to me in Copenhagen was, people in their early 20s who worked their butts off to get Obama elected, and really believed, and for them climate is the issue. It's the issue of their generation, it's the issue of their lives, and they really believe that because Obama recognizes that climate change is real, unlike Bush, of course he would act with urgency. And this is the problem with Obama, just because he can reflect back to us what we believe, he can say our own arguments to us, we assume he agrees with us and is going to act accordingly, but no, he's just like a mirror, he's just lifting. So, and if I could change the subject a little bit, I think one of the things that has happened to the progressive movements, left movements, social movements in this country is that so much of it has been absorbed into the electoral machine, into the never-ending elections that this country seems to go through. And we've seen an independent, vibrant anti-war movement be absorbed almost completely into the democratic machine. We saw it with the Kerry campaign. It was only Democracy Now!, my favorite Democracy Now! Headline. This is just a digression, at the Boston Democratic Convention. Everybody was fawning over Kerry. Democracy Now!'s headline was, John Kerry delivers major pro-war address. But it didn't matter, right? You saw the anti-war movement working their butts off for Kerry, even though he was running on a pro-war campaign.
Are you confusing that with the headline we had for President Obama's Nobel acceptance speech?
No, I'm not. What was that one? That was a major pro-war address as well.
But we changed the names.
But we've all said this again and again, that, you know, we need to rediscover that spirit, that famous, you know, maybe apocryphal quote about FDR that he would say to social movement leaders, progressive movement leaders, you know, when they would present a good idea to him about reforming legislation to be better for workers. He would say, "It sounds like a good idea, now get out there and make me do it." I mean, there was a dialectic, a very strong dialectic between social movements, independent trade unions, and that administration. It was confrontational. And, you know, I think if there's any hope of not just sort of wallowing in cynicism in this political moment on the one-year anniversary of Obama's inauguration, that we need to rebuild our independent social movements. And what I saw in Copenhagen among the young environmentalists who know their science inside and out, who understand carbon trading and why it won't work, are animated by this issue, thought that electing Obama was going to do it. They realized, no, we need an independent movement that's going to push him. And we all need to realize that. So I think if that is one message we get from Copenhagen, then it was worth it.
Can I mean, just to follow on from it, I mean, I think that's right. I mean, it's ironic that you know, we had the president elected on this sort of mandate of change, and then, you know, as soon as the election was over, we were encouraged to, you know, to sort of see him as you know, the pizza delivery guy of change, where we would sit in front of our televisions and he would bring, you know, hot, fresh, steaming change, and it's, I mean, that. And of course, you know, we were encouraged to be passive, and it was interesting to see. I'm sorry, and patient, and of course, you know, that's the great neoliberal virtue, isn't it? Patience.
Is food the metaphor of your life, Ron?
Well, you know, I do tend to stuff it into everything. But I mean, the idea. I mean, it's very interesting, actually. Probably you should mention food, because I do think the food movement in the United States. I mean, I think the food movement in the United States was one of these things, particularly under Bush, where it was possible for progressive politics to make a real, you know, a real transformative change. And in fact, you know, it was interesting at the beginning of the, you know, well, at the end of the 1990s, people used to sort of mock the United States for its absence of thinking about food, and certainly people in Europe thought that, you know, the food movement in the United States looked a lot like that scene in The Triplets of Belleville. Have you seen the sort of slightly ponderous Americans eating all the time and just sort of waddling through streets? And yet, I mean, in Europe now, people look to the United States for leadership, particularly around the food movement. And that, I think, is tremendously exciting. And I think it's a sign of the politicization that food has gone through in the United States. And an example of the kinds of grassroots democracy that are happening. And I know that there are members of the Brooklyn Food Collective here tonight. Where are y'all? Who are getting involved in activism around the Child Nutrition Reauthorization Act. And I think, you know, the kinds of, and that there is a petition to be signed, and I know that'll be available somewhere, so please do sign that. But I mean, I think the food movement is an interesting way in which these movements are happening right here. And I'm excited by the ways in which things like food policy councils offer ways of becoming democratic. I mean, I think you're absolutely right that you know, a lot of what we're induced to be when we're democratic is you know, to get involved in elections. But of course, we don't live in a democracy. I say this from time to time. We live in a complainocracy, where, you know, we elect our leaders, and then after 2 years, if they've disappointed us, we'll elect another bunch of people who will then disappoint us. But what we don't have is a genuine democracy, and I think Athenian democracy, for all obvious, I don't want to live in Athens with slavery and with its, you know, profound misogyny. But what I do want, classical Athenian democracy had an interesting thing about it, which is that it had no elections. In Athenian democracy, at the beginning of every year, 6,000 people would be picked at random to run the city. And then they would run the city for a year in groups of 500. And then at the end of the year, they would be disbanded and another 6,000 would be assigned at random.
It's funny you should say that, because Johan Hari, who's one of my favorite journalists who works at The Independent, he was covering the Copenhagen summit. And at one point he said to me that he really believed that if the country delegations had been selected like jury duty, just random citizens, they absolutely could have come up with a really good deal. Yeah.
No, but that's it. I mean, and it was interesting to see in Copenhagen that it was elites versus elites. And I was curious about your sense of the difference between those elites contending against one another with Seattle, because I know you were at both protests and had a chance to see. To see things really from all angles there. I mean,
it's actually funny. It's one of my dirty secrets is that I was not actually at Seattle because my editor wouldn't send me.
Oh, goodness,
he didn't think it was going to be important, so I was stranded. So No Logo was at the printer, and I wrote about it, but I wasn't there, sadly. But I think there were. I think the dynamics were really different in that with Seattle and many of the other sort of mega protests, outside the G8 or outside the IMF World Bank, the people in the streets were just flat out opposed to what these institutions stood for and their goals. Whereas in Copenhagen, the people in the streets believed in the goals of the institution, at least its stated goals, far more than the people inside. So it wasn't like Seattle in that way. I think what was interesting, where there was an interesting parallel, was in Seattle you had an inside-outside sort of pincer where there were the people in the streets who were who'd shut down the city, but then you also had the developing country governments who were in many ways emboldened by the protests to stand up to the incredible bullying from the US and the European Union to say no to a bad deal. So the reason why the Seattle World Trade Organization talks collapsed was not because there was a protest. It was because the developing countries broke the deal, refused the deal. And that dynamic was certainly at play. But I think that there was much more interplay. I mean, to talk about Bolivia again, but not just Bolivia. I think with some of the developing countries that were pushing some of the more progressive policies, there was much more dialogue, much more fluid. Like, for instance, like as I said, Angelica Navarro, one of Bolivia's leading negotiators, came and spoke at Clima Forum. And there was quite a lot of that, and so did Evo Morales, and he also spoke at Clima Forum. I believe it was at Clima Forum, right? So it was kind of less taking sides, I suppose.
I wanted to ask you, Naomi, about your assessment of President Obama beyond the issue of climate, but on the issue of war and also healthcare as a Canadian. But first, Raj, that introduction of you, that you worked for the World Trade Organization, that you worked for the World Bank, and you've protested them on 4 continents. Just give us a little more, fill that out a little bit.
I mean, I was...
You were at the bank when I met you, I think.
No. That was... Yeah, we met, in fact, when you were in London for No Logo the first time round. And I mean, I was curious about the World Trade Organization and the World Bank. The World Trade Organization I entered as an intern just to see what it was like, and then I reported that to the People's Global Action that was having an anti-WTO camp there in Brazil, in Geneva. And it was interesting. I mean, I worked very hard on, as an intern, I was assigned a project to figure out whether trade increases pollution. And the answer is yes. This apparently was the wrong answer for the World Trade Organization. So I wrote this fantastic, big, chunky report, and they were like, no thanks, and they tossed it out, and they came up with some actually now discredited economics about how there's something called a Kuznets curve, about how actually, as countries get richer, they produce less pollution, and so there's a sort of curve of more pollution and then less pollution. And of course, because they send it to other countries.
And then they yell at China for breaking their climate summit.
Right, exactly. So this was a story that the World Trade Organization, but it was interesting to see how that worked. The World Bank was actually much more insidious. I was there, I was as a graduate student at Cornell, and one of the professors there, a man called Ravi Kambur, was working on the World Development Report 2000. And I was one of his students. He's like, I've got this project for you. You get to look at the World Bank's classified documents, and you get to see how they treat poverty, and you get to write about it critically. I'm like, I'll do that. Classified documents. I'm there. And so, you know, we got these documents. We started coding them up, and then it turned out that what we were encouraged to do was not to write an honest assessment of what the World Bank was doing, but to write a puff piece. And it was published under the title "Voices of the Poor. Can anyone hear us?" I mean, just to give you a sense of how awful this document was, the final paragraph is a narrative from a consultant's classified report. And the report goes like this: "And so, as the sun set on the African plains, we arrived in the village, and the women spontaneously got up and sang us a song. And the song was, 'Here are the World Bank, here are the World Bank. They are here to develop us. We hope they won't forget us,'" end quote. And the final line was, "Will we?" So anyway, and I resigned. But that was published. But so that's what I learned at the World Bank. I mean, basically, but also what I learned at the World Bank is that it's not filled with sort of Blofeldian villains, you know, sort of people sitting in swivel chairs, sort of leather chairs, stroking cats.
Except for Wolfowitz.
Except for the top. But I mean, it's people who believe they're doing the right thing, and who are, you know, I mean, who are convinced of the mission, and that's what makes it much more insidious. Is that, you know, this is the road to hell being paved with good intention.
Goldman Sachs also believes they're doing God's work. Yeah, so keep that in mind.
If someone would bring forward the index cards, we'll draw a few of those questions. But Naomi, as they do, in the introduction, your 10th anniversary edition of No Logo, taking aim at brand bullies, which was so important in documenting the grassroots movements that came together around the world 10 years ago. You take on President Obama today. And if you could extend it to war, healthcare, your assessment.
Well, the reason why I write about Obama in the updated version of the book is that, you know, No Logo is a book about the resistance to corporate culture, but it is also a book about the rise of branding and how that took over the corporate world, and the idea that the central mission of corporations was not to produce products and sell them, but to produce ideas and market them, and it didn't matter who produced their products anymore. They could outsource them. So what I argue in the book is that there's a direct relationship between the fact that we are experiencing an increasingly voracious, aggressive marketing culture and the fact that we are being offered ever more casual jobs. Because if a company decides that it is in the idea business, in the business of creating images and ideas and not producing products, then it will have these effects. They will pour their resources into marketing and design, and they will extract resources from manufacturing and try to have a much more casual relationship with their employees. And I believe that Obama is a super brand, and that the Obama phenomenon is primarily a branding phenomenon. And, you know, I want to take this outside of the question of whether or not we prefer him to McCain, okay? You know, that debate is over. Personally, yes, I prefer him to John McCain. That said, something really powerful happened during that campaign where hopes and dreams were projected onto this blank canvas that was Obama, that we can't just blame on Obama. It's about us. I mean, and I think in order to understand it, we do need to understand how we do this with branding, how we do this with marketing, because I think the Obama machine studied the way in which brands like Nike and Starbucks and Apple have managed to become icons for young people, how they absorb the iconography of transformative movements like the civil rights movement. When I saw that video, the Will I Am video for Obama, I looked at it and I just laughed. I thought, finally, a politician can make ads as good as Nike. Because it had a Nike quality to it, of that, that invitation to imagine transcendence, and you think, hey, he agrees with me, but did he really say anything, really? And so that's why we're in this, and that's what good marketing does. It evokes the emotions, but it doesn't make the commitment, because you don't want to be held to anything, right? And that's why I think we are in an awkward situation with Obama, where we can't really just say, oh, he betrayed us, he promised these things. Because, if you look at what he actually said during the election campaign, he didn't promise single-payer health care. I would have liked him to, but he didn't, okay? He didn't promise to end the war in Iraq. He promised to downsize it and escalate in Afghanistan. And you know what? That's what he's doing, right? So we need to understand that a lot of us were complicit in this exercise of mass projection and irrational exuberance. And he is acting like the brand that he is. And it is pretty precarious, because branding, success in the world of branding, one of the things, like looking back at No Logo 10 years later and updating it, is just like, wow, no one talks about Tommy Hilfiger anymore. A lot of these brands that were sort of on top of the world 10 years ago, fell pretty quickly. And I think in the same way that Obama's kind of like a market bubble. He inflated really, really quickly, and he's prone to deflation very quickly as well for that reason. I don't want to, as I said earlier, I don't think we should just give in to the cynicism. The thing that, I've said this before and I'll say it again, the thing that I don't like about Obama is the same thing I like about Obama. I think he's open to pressure, okay? At the moment, he's being pressured by the wrong people. I don't think it's a hopeless case. I think it's a better situation to have an Obama in office who is open to pressure than it is to have a Bush and Cheney, who's the famous, that Cheney moment that summed it up for me when he was asked, 2/3 of the American public are opposed to the war in Iraq. What's your response? And he said, so, right? Obama doesn't respond to questions like that with so. If anything, he's too prone to changing his position because of whatever they're saying on Fox News at the moment. But I think that there's a real. This is a moment when progressives really, really need to step up, and I don't think we have any reason to believe that he wouldn't respond to pressure. Obviously, I think one of the things we need to be pressuring for is radical campaign finance reform, because that is, I think that's it's the most pressing issue in this country. It is the most pressing issue in this country. And I think it's so urgent because the alternative is just cynicism. Obama won this election when he started talking about the economic crisis and the gap between Main Street and Wall Street. And he was losing the election. People forget this. But when Sarah Palin entered the scene, they pulled ahead in the polls. And those first 2 scary weeks in September, it looked like we were going to have a McCain-Palin ticket that was going to win. And then Lehman collapsed on September 14th. And Obama started connecting with the voters he hadn't been able to connect with previously. And he said the system was broken, and that the system of deregulation and giving more and more to the people at the top and waiting for it to trickle down wasn't working. Now, of course, he didn't promise much. He just said it. So we thought, well, he'll definitely do something about that, right? And here we are, a year and a half into the economic crisis, and nothing has been solved. Nothing has been solved. The too big to fail banks are even bigger. The banks are still leveraged to the teeth. They are still reaping enormous profits from these high-risk debt mechanisms, and, of course, from the bailout itself, which was delivered without any strings attached. That moment of leverage was lost. So why is that? There's a fundamental feedback mechanism that is broken, and what is breaking it is corporate money. Because Wall Street knows how to hedge its risks. That's one thing they know how to do really, really well. And the way they hedge their risks their political risks, is through campaign contributions. They make relatively small, for them, contributions to political parties to insure against the risk of political change. And it's paying off for them. And that is what we need to unblock if there's going to be real change, whether it's healthcare or, frankly, foreign policy as well. I think money is driving foreign policy in a major way.
Clearly, you have inspired, both of you, many people to ask questions. And we would be here for a very long time if we went through them all. But this is going to be rapid fire. Okay. We have 15 minutes to go. And then you can come up and talk to our guests. So I'm going to just throw these out and answer them if you can. And who's making all the pollution? When are we going to know how much damage that has been done?
Very quickly, we are. The way we consume is unsustainable. Of course, the corporations are the ones who are trying to profit from that. But if you add up the way that we've been consuming and the damage that that's caused in developing countries over the past 40 years, for example, and you lowball that figure, if you just make some very conservative estimates, we owe developing countries $5 trillion. Now, of course, the way that we do the math is that developing countries owe us, that they owe us a debt of $1.8 trillion. But actually, at fault is the way that the richest countries have been consuming over the past 200 years, and unfortunately, we need to consume our fair share, and we're consuming way more than our fair share at the moment.
Are either of you involved in organizing students on U.S. college campuses to protest against the price of tuition?
I'm not involved in organizing
them. Didn't you just win the Mario Savio Award where you gave an address at University of California?
Yeah, I gave the Mario Savio lecture, which I know you've given before. For those of you who don't know, Mario Savio was one of the leaders of the free speech movement at Berkeley in the 60s, an incredible speaker who, when did he die? In the not too long ago. And they have established this memorial lecture, and it was great timing because they always bring in activist speakers. But I happened to be giving, just by my luck, the speech at a time when Berkeley was in revolt. And I think Raj, who lives in Berkeley, could speak to this more. So I'm not organizing students, but I tried to incite them as much as I could. But they were already pretty incited. The students throughout the UC system are facing a 32% tuition increase. Their libraries are being closed on weekends. There had just been a successful occupation of one of the libraries on the Berkeley campus when I was there, because the university had closed the libraries on Saturdays. Can you imagine? Telling students they couldn't study on Saturdays. So a group of students and professors had refused to leave the library on Friday night and just stayed there all night. And they won that. That was good. But yeah, I think there's amazing stuff going on in California, and I think California is the canary in the coal mine for this whole economic crisis, which is not over. And I've been saying this since day one. The crisis is not being solved, it's being moved. This was a private debt crisis, a private sector debt crisis that was moved from Wall Street to Washington. We will take your debts. They're fine. The recession is over for Wall Street. They're reaping record bonuses, but who is paying the price? The states are paying the price because their tax bases are collapsing. Why? Because we bailed out Wall Street instead of Main Street. Obama promised that it wouldn't be a top-down bailout. That's exactly what it was. A choice was made to bail out Wall Street instead of bailing out workers, instead of bailing out homeowners. So what has that meant? It's meant people are losing their homes in huge numbers, they're losing their jobs in huge numbers, and that means they're not paying taxes. So right now, the states across the board, California is facing a $25 billion budget shortfall, but across the board, the states are facing an almost $200 billion shortfall. And this is when they're getting stimulus money. So when the stimulus money runs out, there's going to be even more of a shortfall. So how are they dealing with it? They're dealing with it by massively increasing tuition, closing women's shelters. That was one of Schwarzenegger's great ideas, at a time when there's more and more violence against women because there's more and more economic stress. So that's who's paying for these Wall Street bonuses. That is the moral depravity of this political moment.
a very quick coda to that. Schwarzenegger, in his State of the State address, announced that there would be was mooting a constitutional minimum amount to spend on education and a constitutional maximum amount to spend on prisons. What his office said that actually it was the protests that drove that, because again, the protesters were saying that when the state is ready to spend $40-something thousand a year on housing prisoners, but a fraction of that on students, there's something wrong with the priorities. So protest works.
Yep. And I should say that women fought back over the women's shelters and also won that. So when people fight back, they can win. The issue is that it's easier to fight against Schwarzenegger, who's still, he's a right-wing boogeyman, than it is to fight against Obama. People don't know how to deal with Obama.
Well, this is a follow-up on that. Where is the angry populist movement on the left? The militia movement and the white supremacists are joining the teabaggers on the right and co-opting the Republican Party. Are we really ready to follow an uprising from the right? Name change needed, Amy, since the financial coup. Democracy now should be democracy way back when. But that issue of organizing, and it's taken up from questioner after questioner. Any antidote ideas? How can people organize? They're all following a similar theme.
Well, it's all very well to write books about why it's important to organize, but actually, the things that are working well, again, I always come back to food, but it's just, the fact, particularly when there are 49 million Americans going hungry, there's a need. When the right is happy to actually parrot the refrain that Obama said, that the system is broken, and all of a sudden, the various kinds of racist fears are stirred up. There's something that the teabaggers have that's worth taking seriously. It's not Fox News as their oxygen, but it is a genuine anger about the situation that we're in now, and it's important to take, to see how the right is capitalizing on that. But when it comes to food, when it comes to the situation we're in right now, nothing works as an organizing tool like success. If one's interested in building, a movement, then it's important to have examples that work, examples that are meeting people's needs. And when you have, the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense, for example, had as part of its organizing tools things like breakfasts. Absolutely, it was meeting social needs because the state wouldn't meet them. But not merely coming out as a social service organization, but using that to leverage much more profound demands. And I think that there's only so much in terms of sort of sloganeering that works. But particularly, as I say, around food, you're seeing a lot of organizing happening at the grassroots level around feeding hungry Americans. And it's not just around food. You see these movements happening around housing and housing occupation. You're seeing them in education, and this is, for example, as witnessed by the success of what's been going on to some extent in California. And I think so I think that the answer is there are loads of examples of successful organizing, and it's the practical success that helps recruit to a more progressive project rather than good slogans, which we have.
Well, this follows up on your concerns about food. I'm a member of a food co-op about being a more responsible consumer of food, support organic and responsible non-industrial farming, and promote farming sustainability. Apart from cooperatives, what practical things can urban dwellers entrenched in corporate, industrial, retail food system do to help change this unsustainable and destructive food system?
Where do we start? Certainly not buying corporate industrial food is a good way of, and this is not just about food. We're hearing a lot about moveyourmoney.info, for example, and as consumers we can move our money away from the big banks towards credit unions and things like that. That's tremendously important to do. But if all we do is consume smarter, then then we do buy into this, this very American myth that we can together save the world by shopping. And I think we need to recognize that you know, if we're fighting the industrial food system, we need to take political action, because otherwise, you know, corporations will bend to, you know, to adapting to new consumer environments. We need to change the actual political environment, and that means getting involved in everything from the Brooklyn Food Coalition to getting involved in the organizing around the next farm bill, for example, which is already starting now. And if you'd like to know more about that, foodfirst.org has some great stuff.
The Child Nutrition Bill?
Yes, the Child Nutrition Reauthorization Act is one of the big things that's coming up this year. And again, without wanting to take too much time, sign the letter and learn more from the Brooklyn Food Coalition.
Be honest, with the high level of apathy in the world population and the entrenched power of corporations, what hope do we really have to save ourselves?
That's for you, yeah.
You know, I think hope is a choice that we make, because the alternative is unacceptable. So, you know, I don't think we are, you know, we're not making it's not a mathematical equation here. And, you know, I'm always surprised to hear questions like that at events like this, because, you know, why bother coming to an event like this if that's what you think? And I'm hope, you know, I think coming to an event like this is an act of hope. People want to, you know, you can read both of our books. You don't have to come to a room full of people to talk. It's because we want to connect with each other. We have to rebuild our social networks, and this is the truth, that we are living in the wreckage of a failed economic model that hasn't just taken away jobs and security. It has decimated so many of the infrastructures that used to bring us together. That's why, you know, spaces like the Society for Ethical Culture, and I've had many wonderful evenings in this space, are so important. We don't have a lot of spaces like this that are devoted to public discourse for ethical culture. Think about the name, right? You know, even on university campuses, I hear more and more from students that on their own campuses, they're being charged for space for extracurricular activities, which is something that would have been totally unheard of. So, you know, I think it's easy to feel hopeless, particularly when you're at home watching television, but I think things can change very, very quickly when we change the power dynamics. You know, they're few and we are many. And that's why social movements are such a perennial threat, and that's why this consumer model, whether it's the consumer model of politics of just voting and waiting, or shopping your way out of everything, you know, they are all attacks on the idea of social organizations, whether they're trade unions or neighborhood associations. And you know, Raj and I have both looked at different models of organizing, in the developing world in particular, where neoliberalism has this economic model, which is called neoliberalism outside of this country, has already done so much damage that the organizing models in response to it are in many ways more developed.
Well, on that note, and again, going back to the beginning of this evening, in these very dire times, as we look at what's happening in Haiti, I think we have to ask ourselves, can we really afford not to do anything? If not for yourselves, for people who need your help here and in other places, to ensure that people have the ability to organize on their own. And it really does begin right here in this room and in every other gathering place where we talk, where we organize and commit ourselves to making the world a better place. And I can't think of a more wonderful religious experience than, well, these words: the place where people meet to seek the highest is holy ground. We have a lot of work to do. There's a lot of suffering in the world, a lot of suffering even in this room. And only together, if we organize, can we ensure that, well, maybe there'll be a little less of that suffering. And also support independent media, because it's the place where we gather. And now I understand why people say, I listen to or watch Democracy Now! Religiously. Well, I think it's here. The place where people meet to seek the highest is holy ground. Do something about Haiti. and do something to improve your own community, and you'll be making a big difference in the world. Thank you so much.